12 seems to be the age when kids start putting the heat on their parents about the truth behind Santa. I was certainly no exception to this rule. How were Santa's elves able to make that video game I wanted in their workshop? I thought Nintendo owned Mario. Or how about the ever-infamous visiting every house in one night question? Did the Jolly Man own some type of time-extending device? Or perhaps the most obvious question of all, how could he have lived for so long? A lot of people say he trains apprentices who take his place every few decades. Others claim he's just immortal. As for everything else, magic seemed to be the universal lie everyone had agreed on. Whatever the case, I just went with the conclusion that it was my parents' doing. Of course, they deny it and claim ignorance if I confronted them, but it wasn't enough to dissuade my beliefs. So one Christmas Eve, when I couldn't sleep, as these questions danced among my dreams of sugar cereals and new games, I decided to investigate the noises coming from my living room. This time, surely, I would catch my dad or mom in the act of stowing presents under the tree. At least then they'd let me in on the truth. But as I entered the living room, I saw a man before me that I did not recognize. He was dressed in red and white, with a slightly overweight body, and he wore a stringy fake white beard. His hair, or what remained of it, was graying around the edges of his classic Santa hat, and his eyes were wide with fright as he dropped a present under the tree. Being the intuitive youth I was, I came to one of two conclusions. Either this was a home invader stealing my family's gifts, or this was the real Santa. I opened my mouth to scream, but the man rushed towards me and covered my mouth. "Shh, shh," he said, putting a finger to his mouth, trying to smile. Tears began to roll down my cheeks. I was petrified of this man. Then, slowly, he took back his hand and extended it towards me. "It's all right there, little one. You know who I am, right?" I nodded, not shaking his hand back. The trembling man nodded as well, then grabbed an empty sack lying on the floor and gestured to the tree. "Look, see, I bring gifts. Now run along to bed, or I might have to put you on the naughty list. Ho, ho, ho." He started drifting towards the deeper, hearty voice, normally associated with Kris Kringle, but I wasn't fooled. Regardless, I wiped my eyes and began to step back from the living room, trying to create some distance between me and the stranger. The man simply watched, wiped his brow, and proceeded to approach the fireplace. I stopped and observed, confused as to how he was going to leave my house, but a blast of green flames erupted from the chimney, and the man fell back to the floor. I couldn't see his face, but I'm certain it was twisted in fear like my own. A massive, bony hand spawned from the fire, and the arm that followed was draped in raggedy fur. Then another arm, and then the skull of some wild creature with two large horns followed, nearly as large as the fireplace itself. The bones popped and snapped as it slammed its hands onto the floor. The entire monster was engulfed in the flame, yet it did not seem to burn anything in the house.
"Eddie,"
the monster declared, speaking to what I guessed to be the man on the floor. No, I did my part, see? 10,000 houses, just like you said, right? 10,000, I did my part.
"And yet you allowed a human child to see you. You know the rules."
Look, I've learned my lesson. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Just let me go, please. I delivered all the...
"Let you go? Did you let that woman go, Eddie? I don't seem to recall you letting her go. This was your second chance, and you've wasted it."
"What are you gonna do?" Eddie whispered. I could make out his quaking figure being overshadowed by the creature in the fireplace. The next sound to be heard was a crunch, with a soft beginning and snapping finish. I jumped as the sound repeated a few times, finally letting out a shaky breath. I prayed in my head that it wasn't what I thought, but when the creature reared its head towards me, I saw the red and white pants hanging from its mouth as it chewed on Eddie's corpse, then watched it slurp up his legs like strands of spaghetti. I covered my eyes and tried to tell myself it wasn't real, and after a quiet minute, I peeked between my fingers to see the monster staring back at me from the fireplace. The pace of my breathing grew quicker and sharper, my eyes unable to escape from the grasp of those empty eye sockets.
Now run off back to bed, little one, or else I might put you on the naughty list.
My legs finally found the strength to leave, and I sprinted from my parents' room, diving into the sheets with them. There wasn't a trace of the events of the night before when my family went down to the tree the next morning. There was even a little note next to an empty glass and a half-eaten cookie on the table. Have a Merry Christmas. Signed, Santa Claus. As much as I tried to take in the warm, comforting atmosphere that came with Christmas Day, I couldn't stop watching the fireplace, terrified that the monster would return. At the least, now I knew the truth about Santa Claus. My girlfriend had been the first to see it, while I had been the first to see her. Tara, what the hell are you doing? I had found her kneeling on a hill between a triangular-like pattern of tall pine trees and digging furiously into the dry dirt. Fresh blood stained her palms, yet she showed no signs of feeling any pain. I reached down quickly, putting my hands on her shoulders and attempting to pull her away. Tara spun backwards and bit the flesh of my hand. As I recoiled in surprise, she turned back and continued digging farther into the earth. I sat down a few feet away, put pressure on the wound, and watched in a mix of confusion and dread. We had decided on camping for our anniversary. The two of us were experts, not to be arrogant, but it's the truth, and I knew that we would be able to get ourselves out of any situation two campers could find themselves in. I hadn't expected to find what we did. The trip had started out normally enough, the first spot we found having 4 vehicles plopped in the parking lot. "Nah, let's go farther," she had said, smiling and kissing me softly on the cheek. "I want us to be alone." I smiled back. I wasn't about to argue. We went 30 miles farther north, and this time when we arrived at the campground, there wasn't a soul in sight. In fact, the place looked almost abandoned. An eerie feel, you know? A dumpster or two knocked over, I assume from bears, and the vines and various brush were starting to creep over the path and take over completely. We walked for 3 hours, stopping occasionally to kiss, and always joking about school. "When you graduate." "You mean if you graduate," Tara had said. I flashed her a sarcastic look, but couldn't hold back a smile. As the sun was starting to retreat behind the steady backdrop of mountains surrounding us, we had seen the shape of a snake slither off the side of the path. Tara screamed, running a few yards in the opposite direction. She was as brave a soul as I had ever met, but snakes were just not her thing. I called back over to her. "Hey, you should have said, why'd it have to be snakes?" I shrugged. She didn't get the reference. Chuckling, I followed the yellow outline closely through the rocks and down onto a cool creek of the clearest water I'd ever seen, or at least I can remember seeing. Personally, I love snakes. After a minute or so went by and no sign of Tara, I looked down at my new friend. "Well, it's been fun, but the most beautiful girl in the world says we aren't getting married if I have a snake for a pet." Mr. Snake and I shared a moment as I whispered down towards him. I just want you to know you would have been my first choice. It had taken longer than I would have liked to find Tara once I reached the path again. In those few minutes, I wasn't scared. I mean, not in the traditional sense, but there was something. Dread isn't exactly right, but it's close. Premonition, maybe. That's when I saw her digging furiously between the pine trees, blood starting to cake with the dirt along her arms. She had bitten me, and I watched in horror as she continued. Jesus. Why didn't I get up to stop her? A last ray of sunlight found its way through a maze of tall pines and fell onto the black outline. It reflected back up into Tara's eyes, and she immediately began to cry as she fell backwards onto the ground behind her. Finally snapping out of it and holding her tightly in my arms, I helped Tara walk a few yards away and sit up on a log nearby, and then turned my head back towards the black object in the ground. I somehow knew what had to be done. As I walked over slowly, she whispered, "Don't go over there." "I have to," I interrupted, kneeling down over the object. Tara had dug a little over a foot down into the hard dirt, and a small black mirror reflected back up at me. Besides the debris still covering the outline of its edges, it was in pristine condition, I realized. Without wasting any time, I reached into the pile of dirt next to me and was about to bury it again, when it came into view. Inside the mirror was an old woman sitting in a wooden chair, in what looked to be the exact same spot Tara and I were in now. 3 pine trees stood behind her, forming a perfect triangle. Her chair was in the very center. It wasn't exactly like a photo, it was more alive than that. Though she wasn't moving, it seemed as real as anything had before. I was so focused now on the woman that I had forgotten to apply pressure to my hand where Tara had bit me earlier. A single drop of blood slid down my arm and fell down with a plop onto the perfect black glass of the mirror. I watched as the old woman opened her eyes and looked up at me. "Oh my God. What is it, Jason?" Tara asked, not really wanting to hear the answer. I quickly stepped backwards, the crunching of leaves below me making me all the more uneasy, and I looked into my girlfriend's blue eyes. There's a woman in there." She looked at me. Tara ran over and held me close, staring over my shoulder towards the black glass. "Don't look at it," I told her. The sun continued down over the horizon, and I realized it was growing dark far too quickly for my liking. I put my hands on Tara's shoulders and summoned my courage. "I think we should break it." Her eyes drifted back towards the object, and a swell of emotion rose and then fell over her face. "No." "Why not?" "We're not breaking it," she replied. I looked her over. "Then we bury it." I'm burying the thing. Period. And before she could reply, I walked her over to the log and sat her down. "Stay here." Seeing how angry she still was, I knelt down in front of her. "You have to trust me." The resentment fell away, and she hugged me close. "I'm sorry." "You're right. Bury it." I nodded, walking back over to the object and covering it up with as much dirt as I could, all the while making sure not to look back down at the woman. Every fiber of my being wanted to, but I resisted. After a few minutes, dirt fully covered it again and rose up an inch or two from the ground. But it wasn't packed tightly, and the thought occurred to me of someone else or some animal digging it up. I grabbed 4 of the heaviest rocks I could find and set them down on top. "There," I said, wiping my brow. "Now, before it gets dark, we have to get as far away as we can." Tara nodded, and we made our way back towards where we had came from. As we quickly moved down the trail, we made good time, and even after the sun set, our flashlights were strong enough to keep us going at a good pace. Until she felt it. "Jason, I need to sit down," Tara said weakly. I sat down with her. I noticed that she looked thinner, almost frail. "I think it's my hip. It really hurts," she said, reaching out to hold my hand. I looked around and then back at her. "We can't stay here, Tara," I replied, attempting to help her up. Stop, she yelled. "I think it's broken. Did you fall or something?" I asked. But she hadn't fallen. We just didn't yet understand what was happening. I checked my phone, and luck would have it that I finally had a single bar. When the helicopter arrived, the two of us flew together to the nearest hospital. Tara was taken into emergency surgery for a broken hip, among other things. Her blood pressure had dropped significantly, and she was barely able to speak. Surgery was longer than expected, going on until dawn of the next morning. When we finally saw the surgeon, his eyes focused on Tara's mother. "Please come with me for a moment." I stood to come with them, and he motioned towards me. "I'm sorry you'll have to stay here. Only immediate family, and it's okay," her mother insisted. The surgeon nodded and led us into a more private room. "Please sit down." "Is she okay?" Tara's mother asked. "She made it through surgery, but..." He trailed off. "But what?" I replied. He swallowed nervously, and his eyes drifted down and onto the wooden desk in front of him. I've never had an operation like this before." He took a deep breath. "This isn't a medical diagnosis, but she seems to have aged." Tara's mom and I exchanged a confused look as he continued. "I've never seen anything like it." "I want to see her." Before he could reply, I continued. "I want to see her now." He nodded, and after a moment he rose and led us to the room she had been given. Tara's mother fell back against the wall and began to scream as she saw her daughter's body. My girlfriend looked over at us, her face withered and something beyond frail. She looked to have aged 100 years or more. I rushed over, pushed away the shock the best I could, and held her hand. "What's happening, Jason?" she asked weakly. It's been 5 days since that night, and Tara is still alive for now. I've wanted to talk to her. I've wanted to go over the plan I have, but she's only awake for a few minutes at a time, before fatigue takes over and she falls into a deep sleep. I think that I have to go back. I think I have to go back to those hills and those pine trees. I think I have to dig it up again. This time when I see it, I'm gonna break it. Sometimes when I sit at night in my girlfriend's room and drift off to sleep, I can see that old woman inside the black glass staring back at me. I tell myself that I'm imagining it. I tell myself that it's only a dream. There is something that haunts me, though. When I close my eyes and see her, the old woman staring back at me isn't old at all anymore. She's young. It was dark, dreary. The rain clouds had moved on, but water still dripped from the rooftops and skyscrapers. They fell and fell and fell. Hypnotizing. Dangerous in the city where it's already so easy to be caught off guard. The hooded man approached me in the middle of the night as I was walking home from a business meeting that ran late. He said the words that tear at the soul, a question with infinite answers but always a constant result. "I will grant you one wish." I laughed to myself. Crazy person or not, I knew how these stories always went. Make wish, granted in a horrifying way, wisher dies. Simple as that. I'd read The Monkey's Paw. I'd seen Wishmaster. I wouldn't be so carelessly stupid. I thought myself clever when I made my wish. So innocuous that any play on it would be downright foolish. I wish for $1. Had it been a crazy person, even he could have granted this wish. But it was no crazy person. I watched as the hooded man raised his hands, cupping them around the air, and slowly pulled a single dollar into reality, as though out of a black hole. It gingerly floated down into my cupped hands. I looked at the bill, incredulous, and when I looked up, the man was gone. At home, I could do nothing but stare at the bill, unsure if I had truly seen what I thought I had. How could he have done it? Was he really a genie of some sort? Was this bill even real, or am I just dreaming? I was sure I wasn't, but these weren't the questions that bothered me the most. The thought that racked my brain endlessly was, did I just waste a legitimate supernatural wish on a single dollar? I had figured if the man was the kind of genie I'd been brought up by horror stories to believe in, that he would have created some sort of hell for me in this wish. I figured the dollar would create minimal suffering at best, but I hadn't honestly expected the wish to come true anyway. I thought I was just humoring a crazy man. But nothing has happened. The supernatural being granted me my wish and went off. I could have had anything. Anything. I could have wished for billions instead of a single dollar. I could have wished for power. To be superhuman. I could have wished for world peace. But I had $1. $1. I didn't sleep that night. Hell, I didn't sleep for the next week. How could I? Every missed opportunity, embarrassing moment in my past, anything I wanted to change just zipped through my mind. Every little annoyance echoed endlessly in my head. The woman in the cubicle next to me who kept smacking her gum, I could have wished her mouth shut. The guy who kept bringing his work problems to me because he couldn't do them, but still got paid more, I could have wished for him to be fired. My boss, who did absolutely nothing but shit on me day in and day out, I could have wished him dead and had myself put in his place. Saturday, I went into work. The only person who works Saturdays is my boss, that dumb shit. He never really worked. He went in to bang his secretary in empty offices while his wife at home with her 2 kids believed he was at work making them a better life. She would have thanked me. The stapler on my desk would do the trick. I caught the secretary coming out of my boss's office. The back end of the stapler gashed right into her temple. She was out cold. My boss, still buttoning his pants up, tried the old trick of yelling at me and telling me I was fired to get me to stop advancing. But I could see the fear in his eyes. He couldn't even work his zipper right. I pushed him onto the desk, grabbed the fountain pen, and stabbed him in both of his eyes. This time, not so quick as a bash to the head. As he writhed on the desk, I took my rightful seat at his desk. This is what my wish should have been, I thought. This was the happiest I'd been all week. It could have been the happiest I'd ever been, as far as I could remember. Someone must have heard the screaming on one of the lower floors. We were at the top of 16 stories. Maybe it was someone else's boss, screwing a secretary too, who heard us. Someone who didn't have the guts to murder for a better job. Whoever it was, I knew they heard us because I could hear the faint sound of sirens outside the building on the streets below. They probably wouldn't let me keep this job after what I'd done. I went up to the roof of the building, dragging the still twitching body of my former boss. When I got to the top, I found out I was right. Cop cars littered the street. Those are what I aimed for when I tossed the body headfirst off the building. I hit one car dead on. A cop car was always where I thought that guy belonged anyway. I heard the SWAT team bust the door open leading up to the roof. I pulled the dollar bill out of my pocket. My one wish. My one clever wish. I tore it in half and jumped before the SWAT team could grab me. Spending life in a cell would only create more problems I couldn't wish away. As I fell toward the pavement below, I looked down. In the midst of the police, no one seemed to notice a hooded man with glowing red eyes standing directly below me, arms wide as though he were about to catch me. My last thought before I showered the ground with my guts, my only clear thought in the entire past week, was that the devil was far more clever than I. The children in the town knew better than to cross the old bridge in the park, especially during the evening hours on foggy nights. Even the grown-ups stayed clear, knowing that those who dared venture out were doomed never to be seen again. And everyone knows grown-ups are usually pretty naive when it comes to such matters. They had even made an effort to stop people from crossing the bridge by making a gate that closed every day an hour before sundown to block access to the park. The grown-ups seemed so proud of themselves for protecting the little ones, and so the children didn't have the heart to tell them that it was a waste of money, better spent buying birthday and Christmas presents. Everyone knew better than to cross the bridge, so there was no reason for a gate at all. Unfortunately, Eleanor was nobody, and even if she was somebody, she was still a very stupid little girl. Born and raised in the next town over, little Eleanor had only recently moved when her parents divorced and her father and new stepmother got full custody of her. Though she fancied the idea that she was just too clever to get along with the other children, the opposite was in fact true. She was nearly as ignorant as a grown-up, constantly questioning things and demanding evidence for every trivial truth. Some of the harsher rumors claimed that she didn't believe in ghosts, aliens, or even the completely inarguable fact that the 4th grade homeroom teacher, Mr. Mason, was a werewolf-demon hybrid from Heck who worked for the devil himself. Thus, Eleanor had rightfully replaced paste-eating Patty as the village idiot. Even so, Eleanor was very prideful. No matter how much the other children chastised her for saying silly little things like, "There's no such thing as baby-biting sewer clowns," she persisted. It wasn't long before everyone started avoiding her, fearing that her blatant disrespect of the supernatural made her dangerous and unlucky. At first, Eleanor didn't seem to mind too much, as her vanity deluded her into thinking that she was better off alone anyway, since apparently she was just so much more intelligent than all the other children anyway. Still, even nobodies get lonely, and so when she heard the other children discussing the matter of the old bridge in the park, she couldn't help but butt in. "Oh, come on. How is a bridge going to eat children? It's just a bunch of stones." The children had heard her say many strange things, but now she had gone too far. Even the grown-ups knew how dangerous the old bridge was. A few of the kinder, more patient ones gave Eleanor a pitiful glance, reminding themselves that she didn't know any better, But while things like Mr. Mason and the sewer clowns were survivable, the old bridge in the park promised at least a bazillion% chance of never being seen again. Sure, the children hated Eleanor, but they wouldn't wish such a fate upon even the worst of little girls. They begged and pleaded with her to drop the subject as she demanded proof and credible sources of information. Some were valiant enough to promise to invite Eleanor to their birthday parties if she'd only promise never to cross the bridge. But stubborn little Eleanor wouldn't listen to reason or bribery. She swore to them that she'd prove that the old bridge was nothing to fear using a hand-me-down video camera she'd received on her 9th birthday. "Tonight I'm going to cross the old bridge," she said, "and then you'll see how foolish you all are." There was no way to stop her from killing herself without putting some effort into trying. Distraught, the sweet and generous children decided they'd try and be nice to Eleanor on her last day alive. All except Patty, who wasn't too keen on being the stupidest child in school again. Eleanor didn't appreciate their efforts. That night, Eleanor snuck out of the safety of her home, biked to the park, and struggled over the gate. Tonight was particularly foggy, and it took her longer than expected to get to the old bridge. Apparently, the gate wasn't the only precaution the grown-ups took. They had also changed the paths around, so that the only way to get to the old bridge was by following the winding deer paths through the marshy woods. It was eerily quiet. No owls hooted and no crickets chirped. Any reasonable person would have recognized the silence as an omen of horrible tragedy to come, but not a girl who denied even the existence of moon vampires. Armed only with her reckless self-confidence and a flashlight, Eleanor walked to her own demise. By the time she found the bridge, it was nearly 10:15, widely known in the town to be the most sinister of times. Obviously, this was true. Why else would the grown-ups rush them to their rooms and demand they sleep until the sunrise promised their safety? Eleanor either willingly ignored the time or just didn't know its significance as she turned on the camera. Eleanor gave a cheery smile and said her hellos, almost passing as a normal little girl, until going into a smug little rant about how stupid she thought everyone was, and how she couldn't wait to see the looks on their faces when she proved to them that she was right. She was so self-satisfied that God himself probably considered striking her down with a lightning bolt for being so prideful, but then decided he was better off not wasting his precious time. She lifted her foot to step onto the bridge, but hesitated, as if just for a second the ignorance clouding her mind had cleared. It wasn't too late to turn back. If she chickened out now, the other children would surely only make fun of her cowardice for a few weeks, and as a bonus she'd not suffer what was most likely a horrible death. After an agonizing 12 seconds of thought, Eleanor put her foot down on the stone of the bridge. When she wasn't immediately exploded into confetti or elsewhere injured, she let out a whoop of celebration and started bragging incessantly to her camera. Meanwhile, God was probably reconsidering his leniency. As she walked on, she prattled onto the camera and bragged about how clever she was. All in all, it took nearly 5 minutes of self-righteous babbling before Eleanor realized something was amiss. "This is a very long bridge, isn't it?" Thinking she had misjudged the width of the river, Eleanor peeked over the railing only to see there was nothing below her. "And it's so foggy I can't see a thing. Maybe people have gone missing because they fell off." Despite her efforts to see the river, the fog made it impossible to find it. But it had to be there, right? And so she continued on, every step making her more and more anxious. At this rate, the camera was going to run out of batteries. Any rational person would have turned tail and run screaming like a banshee that had stepped on a Lego. But again, Eleanor hesitated. She checked the time on the watch she had borrowed from her stepmother as if it would tick out. Nope, everything is perfectly normal. Do carry on, in Morse code. This must be broken. Surely I've not been walking for a whole 30 minutes. Her panic only rose when she checked to see how long the camera had been recording. Eleanor hadn't pressed the button. In all this time she'd been talking to no one like a complete maniac. Before she had time to swear aloud, her flashlight had the nerve to flicker. Not only had she forgot to record this experience, she'd left her spare batteries at home. Eleanor was in trouble, though she didn't yet realize how much trouble she was in. Even now, she thought the worst that would happen is she'd get lost on the way home without any light to guide her way. Her shoulders slumped, and with a pout, she turned around to head back before her batteries died completely. She felt almost as dumb as she was, wandering into the woods so unprepared. Cockiness killed the cat, Eleanor supposed, though by killed, she actually meant non-lethally inconvenienced. Maybe she'd try again tomorrow night. It felt like 3 hours passed, but in reality it was closer to 2.5. Eleanor, patron saint of not believing anything without proof, ignored the very real evidence of her stepmother's watch telling her it was nearly 1 in the morning. Unable to control herself anymore, she burst into a sprint and ran as fast as her little legs could carry her, desperate to see the bank of the river. Her flashlight gave out, and so did her confidence. She screamed as loudly as she could and fell into a heap onto the cool stone of the bridge. What was she supposed to do now? Turning back clearly wasn't any good, and seeing as the park was closed, there was no one around to hear her pitiful cries for help. And so, Eleanor gave up. Instead of running around screaming, she opted to just sit there and wait for the sun to come up. Surely it'd be a waste of energy to do anything more. Hours passed by, slower than maple syrup right out of a too-cold fridge. Eleanor did anything she could think of to pass the time, practice multiplication in her head, figure out what she'd tell her father when he found out she'd been out all night wandering the woods. Anything but acknowledge that maybe she'd never get off this bridge alive. Though instead of fearing monsters, she was still afraid of earthly things like dying of wolves or boredom. To prevent at least one of those things, Eleanor put on her camera, for real this time, and began recording her goodbyes. At the very least, she thought she could delete it if everything turned out alright. As if on cue, a light in her peripheral vision caught her attention. She quickly turned the camera off and got to her feet. Was it the sun already? No, it wasn't the right color, and it was too small. Could it be? Like a moth drawn to a bug zapper, Eleanor scrambled to her feet and darted for the light. Help me! Hello? The light, or more accurately, the ancient old lady holding the light, responded. Are you lost, little girl? Eleanor slowed to a quick jog, tears of relief swelling in her eyes. No child in the entire world had ever been more happy to see a weird stranger on a bridge. Yes, oh, thank you so much. I was getting worried that I'd never see anyone again. She couldn't yet see that the old woman had no eyes, or that her right arm appeared to be made of solid gold. She didn't see the many rows of bristle-like teeth, or the fingers that seemed to have twice as many bones as they should have. If she had, maybe she'd have stopped herself before running straight into the monster's arms and hugging her close. Please, will you take me home? The monster was taken aback. She'd eaten many children, but this was the first to so quickly give itself up to her. This was very fortunate for Eleanor. If the monster were more focused, she'd have unhinged her jaw and swallowed her whole before Eleanor had the chance to look up and realize she was in mortal danger. With a scream, she threw herself off the monster and back the way she came without even looking back to confirm what she saw was real. Skeptic or not, she was more prepared to face the lonely bridge before facing what seemed to be an actual monster. The old woman regained her wits and let out a cackle before chasing after Eleanor. "Don't you want my help anymore?" Her feet pitter-pattered in such a way that it sounded like she had 3 sets of feet. Eleanor had never been an athletic child and was still plump with baby fat and too many Christmas sweets. But there's something about being terrified half to death that really gets the adrenaline pumping.
"Slow down, sweetie. It's been too long since I've had a good meal. I can't keep up."
Eleanor never listened, but for once it did her some good. Her lungs burned as she took in just enough air to propel her into safety. Though she didn't know it, the other children's carefulness was saving her. The monster was weak enough from hunger that she actually stood a chance of surviving. She was panting too hard to hear that the river was babbling below. Her eyes were too clouded with tears for her to see that the sun was rising and the fog was fading away. The moment the light of morning reached down to the bridge, the monster let out a horrible screech and quickly scurried down into the river. But Eleanor was still running until she was off the bridge and nearly out of the woods. Finally, she slowed to a walk to let her lungs rest. She'd done it. She survived the old bridge. With a start, Eleanor looked at her camera and nearly sobbed with joy. The whole thing had been recorded. There was concrete proof of the horrible monster and her escaping. Heck, she'd only really screamed the one time, so she probably looked pretty brave. The other children would be so impressed with her. Her tearful rejoicing settled into a worried frown. If this was true, then what else? Was Mr. Mason really a demon? Did she really have to worry about sewer clowns and moon vampires and ghosts? Heck, it didn't matter. All that mattered is that she survived. And if she could survive this, she could survive any crazy old thing. Her confidence rose again. No longer was she blind to the world around her. Now she knew better, and she'd use her knowledge for good. Where did that bridge monster come from? Clearly it was weak to sunlight and could only live in darkness. Maybe she could destroy it, but she would need help. The other children knew things, but they were too afraid to fight them. It was time for that to change. Things in this town were going to be completely different from now on. Together, they would rid this town of whatever monsters may plague it. Eleanor sprinted off the bridge and through the woods, breaking out into the road leading back home. The truck had seemingly come out of nowhere, flattening Eleanor before she knew what hit her. Literally. And thus, the first child ever to survive crossing the old bridge died. Not because of the monster that haunted it, but because she was too stupid to look both ways before crossing the street. An old man and his dog stand together looking across the open water. They live in a small coastal town in Alaska. The news reported that the old man's son had drowned while they were out fishing. It was a fluke accident, the reporter had said. There was nothing more anyone could do. The old man and the dog glanced at each other, then back at the water. They knew better. It had been a dark, foggy night as the old man and his son Thomas had been out fishing. They always brought their dog Crichton, who loved to be out on the boat. The two men were enjoying a beer when the dog started to growl. "What is it, boy?" Thomas asked. In an instant, Something huge had latched onto Thomas's arm. He fell back into the water. His father jumped in after him to no avail. The dog and the old man were forced to watch as the dark thing took his son, pulling him down deep into the water. That had been 1 week ago. An accident? No. Though it was dark, the man had made out 2 distinct yellow eyes. He swore the thing had smiled back at him as it pulled his son farther and farther into the darkness. A week later, having hardly left his home, the old man filled up the dog's food and water bowls on the porch. He locked the front door of his little house and put the key in the mail. Walking down to the dock, the old man was lost in thought. He held back tears as he knew he would never see his son again. He would never get to talk with him, never hear him laugh. The monster had taken all that away. Boarding the 30-foot sailboat, the dog quickly jumped on before the old man could push the boat off from shore.
Where do you think you're going?
The dog looked back up at him and towards the open water.
I don't think we're gonna make it back, boy.
Seeing what looked like determination in the dog's eyes, the old man nodded. The dog had left his son too. Armed only with an old spear gun and a knife his son had given him, he had decided to kill whatever had taken Thomas. They motored into the night, 1 week exactly from the day his son had died. Same time of night, same foggy conditions.
I figure it was sometime around midnight, the old man said,
turning the old wooden wheel of the boat and scanning the fog.
Maybe it hunts at midnight.
The dog stood silently near the wheel, not leaving the old man's side. It wasn't until 2 a.m. that the creature finally showed itself. It peeked its head up from under the water. Though it was 100 yards out, 2 large yellow eyes stood out in the darkness of the water. The dog growled fiercely as the old man grabbed the spear gun and stared at the creature. They locked eyes. The monster slowly moved farther out, not in fear, but beckoning the old man and the dog to follow. And they did. It led them out miles from shore into the beginnings of a storm. Watching Crichton pace back and forth, the old man watched the creature in the water ahead of them.
I know what it's doing, boy. It don't matter. We ain't coming back, but that thing ain't either. We're gonna kill it. For Thomas.
As the sailboat was now fully in the storm, the hull shook violently with each new wave. The 2 of them took cover below and kept watch through the small windows as they waited. Suddenly, the monster appeared. It broke the glass of the window and slashed its claws into the flesh of the old man's shoulder. The spear gun dropped from his hands and slid across the floor. Barking furiously, the dog lunged at the monster and bit down. Screaming in pain, the thing leapt away from the shattered window. They could hear it moving around them to the other side of the boat. Dark red blood poured from the man's shoulder.
I'm alright. Let's kill it, boy.
He grabbed the spear gun and opened the hatch as they went outside cautiously into the storm. The rain was blinding, and they could barely see.
Where is it, boy?
Seeing something rush towards him, the old man fired the gun quickly and struck the monster. Even at 72, he was a hell of a shot. As he bent down to reload the gun, the creature came at him again. It hit the old man full force in the chest, knocking him back and sinking its razor-sharp teeth into him again and again. Then a scream of surprise and rage echoed through the downpour. The creature felt the strong jaws of the dog lock on the back of its neck. Its claws flailed wildly, raking the dog's side, but the dog never faltered. He stood with his paws on the thing's back and bit down hard. There was a snapping sound, and the creature lay still. But its eyes were still aware, and as it lay, unable to move, it watched the old man and the dog with a rage and pure hatred.
You shouldn't have taken my son.
Staring back at the monster, the old man found the handle of his knife and plunged it deep into the creature's skull. With a shudder, its raspy breath stopped. It was finally dead. They had killed it. Sitting back down to rest for a moment, the old man struggled to stand. He dragged the creature's limp carcass to the back of the boat, pulled it up and over the side, and let it go. The old man and the dog watched as it slid, lifeless, into the sea. As the two of them sat together on the boat one last time, the old man rested his hand on the dog's head.
Good boy.
He pulled out his flare gun and shot it once, far into the sky.
I'm sorry, boy. You stay here.
Though the sky was beginning to clear, the lingering wind still shook the boat from side to side. The dog watched as the old man closed his eyes. His head fell to his chest, and he slid peacefully into the sea. Almost jumping in after him, the dog quietly whined and paced back and forth. The old man had told him to stay. Sometime later, the Coast Guard pulled up next to the boat. They found only a large German Shepherd, covered in blood, looking down into the water. And that's how it came to be, that an old man and a dog killed the monster. Ever wondered if things can just be born evil? In this enlightened age of ours, concepts like good and evil are often painted as outmoded, archaic even. According to modern thought, people, animals too obviously, are simple products of their environment and no more responsible for their actions than a twig in a stream. But I know better. Some things are just born bad. About 10 years ago, we had a German Shepherd named Duchess that had a litter of puppies, 7 in all. 6 looked like any other shepherd you've ever seen. The 7th was a snowy white. Not a true albino, just white-furred with a black nose and blue eyes. There was never any doubt about which one we were keeping out of that litter. We named her Princess. Before the end of 6 months, any plans we had about giving away or selling the others became a moot point, as all of the others were dead. We'd just find them at a rate of about 1 a month, not mangled or anything, just dead as if they died in their sleep. At first, we thought maybe their mother, it being her first litter and all, was accidentally crushing or smothering them. Later, we had no doubt as to what had killed them. Within a year, she came to dominate her mother, her father, tough old alpha that he was, and to a degree, us too. Her parents shied away from her. When we put out their food, she ate to her heart's content, unchallenged by the other two. Once I tried to shoo her away and let the other two eat. She snarled at me, baring those perfect white fangs to her black gums, and loosing a growl so deep that I felt it in my guts more than heard it. After that, I left her alone too. I've often wondered if the parents of serial killers know that they have a monster in the making. I mean, sure, some of them are to blame for how their kids turn out, products of messed up households with systematic abuse of all possible flavors. But then there are the ones that seem to be true aberrations. It's those families I'm curious about. Do they smile and laugh and pretend that everything's fine? I know that we sure did. We downplayed the weirdness around Princess, tried to rationalize her behavior, the bizarre things she'd do, like killing rabbits and leaving them hung up in the bushes behind our home. Some dogs do that to show they love you. Cats too, my father would say. To them, it's just bringing you food. To me, it's like she was taunting us. Just like the puppies years earlier, not one of those rabbits ever had a mark on them. Princess, just like her mom and dad, was well looked after and never hurt for a meal, so it wasn't as if she was hunting for food. Her innumerable kills were always untouched. No, the only thing I ever saw her eat was a kitten. We had some feral cats in the woods around our house, and one mama cat had a litter in our tool shed. I returned home from school one day and headed around back to look in on them. The door to the shed was open, and inside I found Princess, her jaws pink from her feast. As she devoured that last kitten, her beautiful blue eyes never left mine. The mama we found displayed on what I'd come to think of as the rabbit bush. The tipping point came that same year when we found her sire dead. He was the best dog we'd ever had, that we ever will have. We woke one Saturday morning to find him in the backyard lying dead without a mark, like so many rabbits before him. I can count the number of times I ever saw my father cry on one hand. That was one of them. That was also when we found out how she killed so cleanly. She strangled her prey, like a jaguar. The fur at her father's neck was still wet with her saliva. We spent that morning burying that good old faithful dog, and then he sent me and my mom away on some pretense. No words were spoken, but there was no doubt about what he intended to do. I'm sure that there are some of you reading this that will find the notion of putting an animal down to be abominable. But what other options did he have, really? Take her to an animal shelter? Give her to some other family? Who could do that and go to sleep with a clear conscience? As it turned out, we weren't getting any sleep that night regardless of our decision. We spent that afternoon at my uncle's house. Once, when I came in from playing to get a glass of water, I overheard my mom telling my uncle that she sometimes wondered if the dog was possessed or something. I'd sometimes wondered the same thing. Later that evening, not long before sunset, we got a call from Dad. Apparently, the deed was done. By the time we arrived home, he'd already washed up and changed clothes, but there was little he could have done to hide his wounds, even less to hide the haunted look in his eyes. Both his arms and one leg were bandaged, and that was bad enough. But what stuck with me all these years later was just how terrified he looked. It wasn't until I'd actually been through combat that I recognized that expression. It's how men look after they've stared death straight in the face. My father never talked about it, but he drafted a friend from up the street to come help, and it's from him that I get this part of the story. Princess was many things, bloodthirsty and evil chief among them, but stupid wasn't among them. In that, if nothing else, she took after her father. Her dad, Rocky, was famous for letting himself into the house if it was storming out. He'd figured out how to paw open the sliding glass door out to the patio. What was really astounding is that he also had the presence of mind to close it behind him. Not being stupid, she knew something was up and made herself scarce, disappearing into the woods. Dad, not wanting to put this off and being in full-on revenge mode, called his friend from down the road and filled him in. So off on the hunt the two of them went. In his own words, she was laying for us. If it sounds absurd to say that Princess lay in ambush, then I failed at conveying just how wrong everything about her truly was. She led them on a chase through those woods, barking whenever it seemed the stupid humans had lost her again. Then she laid up beneath an overhang on the creek bank, just where the path crossed it, and she waited. She was on my father the instant he stepped down into the creek, grabbing his leg and making him fall headfirst into the water. Then she went straight for his throat. My dad had already lost his rifle at this point, and he grabbed her with both hands to try to fend her off, wrestling with 115 pounds of teeth, claws, and muscle in a 1.5 feet of water, Princess savaging his arms all the while. At some point, he managed to work his legs up between him and the dog and kick her away from him, providing his friend with a clean shot, which he took, catching Princess through the chest. He put a second round through her head. He then helped my dad back home and to the emergency room, telling him he'd go back to see after Princess once they got home. "She can rot where she is," was all my dad had to say on the subject. After they got back from the hospital, our neighbor went back on his ATV to pick up Princess for burial. He was a dog lover like us, and it just didn't seem right to him to leave her. If he'd spent as much time tiptoeing around as we had, he might have felt differently. "She flat wasn't there," he said. "No blood trail. Nothing." He also said that after he'd been there poking around for a few minutes, he noticed something else strange. No birds. It was dead quiet. The way the woods sometimes get right before a bad storm blows in. Wisely, he got right the hell out of there. There was a storm coming, all right. That night, Duchess came pawing at the back door, wanting in, something she'd never once done in all the time she'd been with us. And I had a dream. In my dream, I was playing football in the backyard with some buddies, and ran over to where a bad throw had landed near Rocky's grave. As I reached for it, Princess's head shoved up out of the ground to grab my hand. I woke up with a jolt and was promptly scared out of roughly 10 more years of my life by the silhouette of a German shepherd in the hallway. It was Duchess, of course. She was sitting in the hallway, whining and wagging her tail nervously. She was looking back towards the front of the house. I walked over to her and placed my hand on her big doggy head and said, "What is it, girl?" That's when I heard the distinctive sound of claws on glass. Something was pawing at the patio door. Thoroughly terrified, I grabbed Duchess by the collar and dragged her along with me to my parents' room, shutting the door behind me. I was 14. I was terrified. But even in that terror, retreating to my parents' room wasn't just for the security of Mommy and Daddy. That's where the guns were. I woke them up and told them what I'd heard. Dad got up and locked the bedroom door and said, "Y'all lock yourselves in the bathroom." I heard the patio door slide open. If any of the rest of us had any doubts about what had just come into the house, Duchess sure didn't. The only thing she'd ever feared in this world was her own pup. A deep rumble of a growl vibrated in the floor beneath our bare feet, and Duchess's bladder let go as if on cue. Mine wasn't far from doing the same. What followed was a 6-hour exercise in pure terror, punctuated by snarling attacks on the bedroom door, crashes through the rest of the house as Princess found more things to break, whispered prayers from my mother, and litanies of curses from my father as another of his attempted forays out of the bedroom was thwarted. We were without a phone. The one on my parents' nightstand was dead. We'd later find the phone line to have been ripped out at the main box. My mom suggested that we try to make it to the car, and above and beyond everything else, it was my father's response to the idea that really scared me. Of the three of us, he was supposed to be the rational thinker, but what we got instead was
Honey, I think that's what it wants us to do.
As the world through the windows turned from black to gray, a quiet fell over the house. Mom and I watched through the windows, craning our heads in an attempt to get an eye on the patio door. But try as we might, the best we could manage was a view of most of the patio. More than enough concealment for a dog to slink in or out, even a big one like Princess. After an hour of silence, my dad quietly opened the bedroom door. I remember thinking what a useless gesture any attempt at stealth was. Dog senses are so much more acute than ours that we might as well have fired a 21-gun salute. Dad stopped in the hallway and shooed me back to the bedroom. "Don't come out until I say." Carefully, he made his way through the house to the patio door. We heard him shut it before he shouted back to us to stay in the bedroom till he told us to come out. Through the door, I could hear him moving around, and what seemed to be him dropping things into a garbage bag. After about 30 minutes, he gave us the all clear. What greeted us was a disaster. Ripped up cushions and pillows, destroyed furniture, shredded papers and books all over the floor. But most terrible were the smears of gore all over everything. My mother wondered aloud at what she drug into the house. Grim-faced, my father didn't answer. He simply turned and headed out the back to bury Rocky for a second time. We cleaned up as best we could while Dad drove down to our neighbor's house to make all the appropriate calls. After all these years, I still wonder what portion of homeowners insurance covers attack by undead demon ghost dog. Unspoken, we all wondered what the night would bring. As it turned out, we never got a repeat, but Duchess never left the house again. Time rolled on. Occasionally, we'd find a new present on the rabbit bush. Just a friendly reminder, another token of Princess's abiding love. About 2 years into college, my dad called to tell me that our neighbor had passed away. "Heart attack in his sleep, the coroner says," said my dad. But what we were both thinking was, not a mark. There are plenty of nights where I wonder what the last thing was to pass before that old bachelor's eyes. I can guarantee you it stared right back. I've seen firsthand how it feeds. Not long after that, my folks put the house up for sale. I sort of acted as go-between on that deal. About a week after the new owners moved in, I received a call from the man of the house. He wanted to know if we'd left any pets behind when we moved. Already fearing the answer, I asked him why he asked. "Oh, me and the kids keep seeing this white shepherd in the woods. Pretty." Pretty. I work the night shift in an observatory. It's usually a pretty quiet job, that is until about 3 weeks ago. Publicly, I can't tell you the name or the exact location. The FBI was extremely clear about that. But it's the one that was suddenly shut down and the surrounding town evacuated. Yeah, that one. It's a good job and I thought that I would stay here, but I don't know anymore. In the evening, when I'm driving the winding road up the mountain, I get to the turnoff that leads to the observatory and I just sit there, thinking, maybe I should just keep going, around the looping drive, back down to my house, throw my stuff in the car and just disappear. But then I think that's crazy. So I'm writing it all down, what happened. Maybe writing will help me make a decision. The observatory is not just one building. It's more of a secluded complex. There's the main offices, a small shed where I'm located, and the tall white octagon that houses the telescope and equipment. It's located at the peak of the mountain, surrounded by an old forest. If you walk down the driveway to the main road, to the right is the drive back to town at the base of the mountain.
To the left is a 2-mile loop that brings you back to the observatory. Most nights around midnight, for my dinner break, I walk the loop. You can walk right down the middle of the road. There's no traffic and no streetlights, and I like to stop and look up at the stars. Walking along in the dark, it's like I can see every star in the sky. It's unreal. At most observatories, scientists are selected for a 6-week stay. Here, it's a little different. A while back, there was a problem with one of the 6-weekers. Some very expensive equipment was destroyed, some of it irreplaceable. So the observatory board lobbied and was given a large grant. Then they had hired a permanent in-house astronomer. Since I can't use his real name, I'll call him Aaron. The first few days after Aaron was hired, we were busy moving boxes and setting up equipment in the office. Then one night, retrieving something from his car, Aaron spotted me having my midnight dinner outside at one of the picnic tables. He asked if he could join me. I nodded and we talked while we ate. I found out that he was divorced with no kids. It was the same for me, minus the divorce. As the nights went by, we became friends. Often it was just the two of us up there, and we settled into a routine. We would take our meals outside at around midnight. Then he would head back in and I would take my walk around the loop. I never took my phone with me. I left it in a pocket on my tool belt that I left on my desk. Aaron said that I should keep it in case of emergency. I replied that if aliens attacked, I would be back in about 20 minutes. He would have to hold them off until then. And so things went until 3 weeks ago. It was a Saturday night, so it was just the two of us. We had our dinner at the picnic table as usual, and I told Aaron that I was having trouble with the old intercom system between buildings. I told him I might test it later on. He said he always kept his headphones on while he worked, so he probably wouldn't even notice. He liked to listen to music and the local news. As Aaron got up, he said, "I've been hearing some static tonight. Maybe it's from you playing with the intercoms." He looked back at me, smiled, and said, "Enjoy your walk," as he headed back inside. That was the last time I ever saw him. I was about 10 minutes into my walk when I noticed that clouds had begun to obscure the night sky. I picked up my pace, and that's when I heard a large boom. It shook the ground I was standing on. There was a crashing in the woods to my left. Suddenly, a deer ran past me across the road and jumped into the brush. As I stood there stunned, I could hear a low humming sound, almost electric, like a transformer. The sound was coming from over my head. I looked up. Something felt very wrong. You know how you can feel when someone is watching you? I felt like a specimen under a microscope. I turned and started running back towards the observatory. I cut through the trees. It was darker, but it was a much faster way back. I don't know why, but it almost felt safer under the trees. 5 minutes later, I burst through the tree line and kept running across the clearing and through the door, shouting Aaron's name. There was no answer. "Aaron," I shouted again. And then I remembered, he's probably got those damn headphones on. And I ran up the stairs to his desk and froze. His chair was overturned, and 2 of the monitors had been smashed onto the floor. I moved slowly towards Aaron's desk. His phone was still there, but my eyes were drawn to his headphones. They were twisted and had what looked like blood mixed with clumps of gray matter on the earpieces. Scrambling back, I reached for my phone, and then I remembered my phone was on my desk in another building. I approached the bloody desk and carefully picked up Aaron's phone. There was no signal. Wait, they still had an old landline connected downstairs. I called the police and told them everything. I said to get an ambulance up here fast, that Aaron had been badly injured. I went out to search all the other buildings, but I never found him. The police arrived and continued the search as I sat on the couch in my office and answered their questions, until the feds arrived and made it clear they were taking over the investigation. They shut down the whole town, and I think they did flyovers of the Black Hawk. I answered all their questions again. This time it was made clear to me that I wasn't to tell anyone about what happened here. They threw around words like confidential and ongoing and prosecutable offense. 3 weeks later, the feds gave their statement. They said they had found child pornography on the suspect's computer. They never named the subject. Since Aaron was the only one missing, everyone just assumed it was him. But I know it wasn't. I know what I heard, and I know what I saw. So I ask you, when was the last time the FBI shut down an entire town and brought in a Black Hawk helicopter for a person looking at pornography? And there's so many people now that are just gone.
My name is Eric Williams, and I work as a political reporter in Washington, D.C. I cover Congress, the president, and whatever happens to be the trending topic of the day. I have a couple of sources that I trust and a few that I don't. But as luck would have it, I have found that my most important source of reliable information turns out to be my dog, Applejacks. Let me back up a little. About 3 years ago, I was heading out of my apartment building to do a follow-up on a story, when I heard a rustling in the hedges that flank the wide stone steps by the entry. I figured that it must be the raccoon who had been getting into the dumpster, and I gave it no more thought. On my return trip at around 11 p.m., I was halfway up the stairs when I heard a low whine coming from the bushes. So I backed up and peered into the dark undergrowth till I spotted the reflection of 2 eyes looking back at me. They were a good 3 feet up from the ground, so I started to back up when I heard the unmistakable low thumping of a slowly wagging tail. "Hey there," I said in a calming voice. I moved back and sat down quietly on the bottom step. "You hungry, bud?" Unzipping my backpack, I fished around at the bottom, but all I could find was an energy drink and an old single-serving pack of cereal, Applejacks. I opened it and set it down on the step next to me. It took a few minutes, but then he slowly stepped out of the bushes and made his way cautiously towards the food. He was big, but I could tell he was less than a year old. He was rail thin and looked like he hadn't eaten in a while. Keeping one eye on me, he gingerly sniffed the Applejacks. Then hunger must have overtaken him and he wolfed down the cereal. He flipped the bag over with his nose, checking to make sure he hadn't missed any. Then he looked up at me. I let him sniff my hand and then slowly gave him a scratch behind the ears. Tail wagging, he climbed onto the same step that I was on. Then he sat down, leaning against me. And that was it. We've been together ever since. I looked online, checked the papers and the local bulletin boards for a few weeks to see if anyone was looking for him. After a while, I stopped checking. Soon, we settled into a routine. I took him out in the morning, then he slept for most of the day. In the evening, we went for a long walk in the park. The park we visit is sort of a dividing line between the very rich section of town and the slightly run-down section where my apartment is located. It's a huge park that goes on for miles, with a small river running along the length of it. There is plenty of room for him to chase a ball or run around with other dogs, but it quickly became apparent to me that Jax didn't like the company of other dogs. He wasn't aggressive, he just completely ignored them. They would approach him, tail wagging, wanting to play, but he kept his eyes on me. Along the river there were several old stone bridges and he loved to run down them, 1,000,000 miles an hour, race across, then turn around and run back to me. This ritual would be repeated at every bridge. I would stand there laughing, urgently calling him back, as if it was a life and death situation. Sometimes he was a little late with the brakes and he would plow into me, landing us both on the ground. Then, one particular Tuesday evening at the park, he crossed the bridge and stopped on the far side. He stood there looking into the woods. He glanced back as if to tell me something. Then he headed straight for the woods. I called, but he kept going. By the time I made it across the bridge, all I could see in the distance was a man kneeling over something on the ground. So I ran. "What happened?" I called out. As I approached, I saw the man had tears in his eyes. There was a golden retriever on the ground in front of him, and Jax was laying with his head on top of the dog's chest. "Did he hurt your dog?" I asked. "No," the man said. "I think he saved him. My dog was having a seizure. They're usually quick to stop if I can calm him down, but this time it wouldn't stop. Not until your dog came and laid down next to him. It seemed to calm him." "Will you be able to get him home?" I asked. "Yes, I'll carry him. We live just over there." He pointed at a large house up on the hill. "Well, I better get him home. Thank you." About a week later, the man with the golden retriever spotted us at the park. He waved and walked over with his dog. It turns out he was looking for us. It turns out his name was Gregory Williams. It turns out he was just elected to the House of Representatives. I am buying Jax a triple cheeseburger on the way home. Maybe two. Since then, Gregory and I met at the park every Tuesday, and we've become good friends. The dogs play together while we talk, and once in a while, he'll give me a heads up on a story. I'm always careful to keep his name out of it. Months went by, and the first Tuesday in December rolled around. We met at the park as usual. While the dogs played, Gregory told me that he was leaving early for Christmas break, taking his family up to a cabin in Colorado. He invited me to come, with Jax, of course. I said that sounded great, but I couldn't take that much vacation time. He told me nothing's happening in DC until after the holidays. Here. He reached for my phone and entered a number. That's the phone to the cabin. Get away as soon as you can. Drive up to Colorado Springs and call me. I'll direct you to the cabin. Make sure you bring Jax and anyone else you like. I mean it. Please come. My wife and kids are dying to meet the hero that saved our dog. And you." I laughed. "Okay, I'll try." He looked at me, paused, then said, "If you get there by the 15th of December, I'll give you the story of a lifetime." Then he nodded and walked away. His dog followed behind. I stood there silently watching him go. Back in my apartment, I poured scoops of dog food into Jack's bowl, and I heated up some leftovers for myself. I had an interview tomorrow morning with Senator Susan Collins, the chairman of the Housing and Urban Development Committee, so I sat down on my computer to finalize my questions. I turned on the local news as background noise while I worked. There had been 2 shootings and a robbery nearby. A 10-year-old had gotten lost and then was found safe at a local Walmart, and skywatchers may have a spectacular show in 2 weeks when a comet makes its closest approach on the 16th of December. Jax was sound asleep by the time I finished up and went to bed. I awoke in the morning to a soft beep of a message left on my phone. It was the senator's secretary canceling today's meeting. I called her office to reschedule, but there was only a recorded message saying the senator's office was closed for the holidays. With the morning off, I took Jax for a leisurely walk. Then I caught the train to the Capitol building. I walked over to the congressional offices to see if I could gather some info on an upcoming vote. The guard checked my press ID and nodded. I walked down the quiet hallway to the elevator. Stepping out on the 4th floor, I turned right and stopped. Ahead of me was a long hallway. There must have been 20 small offices. Every door was closed. Lights off. This was very odd, so I got back in the elevator. Stopping at every floor to check, the entire building was completely empty. This just doesn't happen. There are always congressional staff milling about. On my way out the door, I asked the guard what was going on. He just shrugged and said, "No idea." Grabbing a coffee from a nearby street vendor, I sat down at a bench overlooking the main walkway. Taking out my phone, I called my list of political contacts one by one. Either there was no answer, or a message was left saying, "I'm sorry, the office is closed for the holidays." The Congress was slated to work until December 21st. Votes were scheduled for each day. This just doesn't happen. I sat there thinking, vaguely aware of the tourists passing by. A family with 2 kids sat down on the bench next to mine. The kids were asking their dad, "Will we be able to see it?" "Yes," their dad answered. "You might not even need a telescope." Suddenly, I got this vision of thousands of people gathering with binoculars, having comet-themed parties. All the while, silent doom approached. Tossing my coffee into the garage, I headed for the train. I arrived home, took Jax out for a quick walk, and then sat down at my computer. What should I even look for? Impact? No, too many amateur astronomers out there. The news of a catastrophic impact would get out to the public. I spent the next week and a half achieving little to no results. Nothing in the news but excitement over the easily visible approaching comet. I even checked the conspiracy websites, but found nothing out of the ordinary. It was around 11 p.m. when it finally occurred to me that I should stop looking in the present and try looking into the past. I typed in the history of comets. Comets shed a lot of debris, pieces of which can slam into Earth. Comets can cause an air burst, igniting entire forests. They can also produce a high-altitude haze of particles. A comet is linked to the Justinian plague in 541 AD. It was the first recorded instance of the Black Plague in Europe, when cities struggled to clear the streets of the dead. There was the Comet of the Black Death in 1347. During the winter of 1664, a bright comet was seen in the London sky. The Great Plague ravaged England for the next 2 years. I stopped reading, and I realized that if something was coming, Washington was the last place I wanted to be. It was 1:15 midnight, the early morning of December 15th. If I threw my stuff in the car and drove straight through to Colorado Springs, with a little luck, we could make it. I looked over at Jax. "Want to go for a ride?"